So as you can see, QuickTime is not available. What this video is actually what started me in this research. And I say that because this particular CNN piece, if QuickTime were installed, would go out and basically say, I could play it on this, I guess, yeah, and just turn it around. No. Yeah. So ultimately what the CNN article or the CNN story was CNN going out and saying, ISIS is all over, they are in your computers, they are compromising the electrical systems, they are compromising water systems, etc. And I started the conversation by first wanting to show that because I'm tired of hearing that. And that's the reason that I started to perform this research, was because I wanted to prove, is that true? Meaning, was CNN correct? Or are they not? And spoiler alert, they're not correct. But that's spoiler alert. So before I kind of jump into this, what I want to kind of talk about is the difference between cyber terrorism and hacktivism. A lot of times whenever I go out and I start talking about these two subjects, it's hard for many people to understand what the difference between true cyber terrorism and hacktivism is. Realistically, the best way that myself and the government contractor, whenever I was working on this particular research, one way that we had designated it was the ultimate resulting in violence. And it could be violence against non-combatant targets, it could be against subnational groups, intelligence agencies, etc. But ultimately, what the primary concern is that does the actual attack result in violence? Meaning, if the power grid goes down, how many people die? That kind of thing. So that's realistically the main differentiator that I'm trying to show before I even get started talking about any of this stuff. Also keep in mind that throughout the presentation I'll be talking about several domains as well as file hashes. If you want any of that information, feel free to reach out to me and I can share that with you either privately, I can share the hashes or the files themselves. So please keep that in mind. I want to first talk about kind of the history of quote-unquote cyber terrorism. And ultimately, I hate that term, but it fits well, unfortunately. A majority of the conversation that I'm going to be having today focuses on ISIS or ISIL, which I think everybody is familiar with. But it's important first to talk about other groups that are also involved in quote-unquote cyber terrorism. First, there is a group called Gaza Hackers, and these particular individuals are primarily operating in the Palestinian region, compromising and defacing websites, primarily against people that are not of their particular belief system. I won't go into great detail on any of these groups because most of them are just skids. They're all script kiddies for the most part, compromising with very basic SQL injection or doing cross-site scripting, that kind of thing. So super, super skid. Muslim Hacker, this is another individual as well as a group. This particular individual had started an actual collective group for recruiting purposes as well as for getting donations as well, and then distributing that out to additional groups operating, again, within Palestinian region. Anonymous Ghost Gaza, this is where we started to watch kind of the blend between quote-unquote cyber terrorism and cyber criminals. So started to see some of that bleeding together. These particular individuals, as you might guess, operate in and around the Gaza region. And this is their Facebook page. And I'll talk more about the kind of the social aspect of what ISIS and ISIL is using today from a social perspective. But as it stands right now, it's important to understand that Facebook consistently, there are these groups that are popping up consistently, including ISIS and ISIL on Facebook. And again, I'll talk about that more here in a few minutes. Now I'm going to jump over to the ISIS or ISIL kind of group. And realistically, when I'm talking about these specific groups, ISIS is formed, and the way that their online presence is formed is multiple smaller groups operating independently, all coordinating back to one centralized group. One of those smaller subgroups is called the Caliphate Cyber Army. These particular individuals, as you can see, are designated and broken out based on what their particular function is. So for instance, Ghost Caliphate, the particular actor in the top left corner, was primarily responsible with performing SQL injection. So his quote-unquote expertise is SQL injection. Again, I would really classify him as a skid. He is not really that advanced. But nonetheless, Caliphate Cyber Army has been active and has been working over the past 3 to 4 years, roughly, and they've ultimately been rolled into a larger group, which I'll talk about in a second. The ISHD, or the Islamic State Hacking Division. Again, these particular individuals are what I would classify as not necessarily advanced, but they are very good at creating hit lists, meaning attacking US and UK government systems, and Australian too, as of late. And they'll actually attack those systems and then publish kill lists based on the information that they ascertain from those databases. Sometimes it will be 200 individual pieces of identifiable information. Other times it'll be like 20, literally 20 records from a database that they've compromised. And they go out and make a big hubbub about it and talk all sorts of really great things about it. And in all actuality, again, it's not advanced. Islamic Cyber Army, again, very similar to the other groups. Primarily, this group has been focused and was focused on attempting to look at electrical grids or SCADA or operational technology, as well as doing the same kind of defacements, etc. So a little bit more specialization, a little bit more interest being paid, again, into operational technology environments, that kind of thing. Sun's Caliphate Army. This group actually became kind of popular whenever they had targeted Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, basically calling for his execution. Obviously, that didn't happen, primarily because, again, this group is full of skids. And ultimately now there's the UCC, or the United Cyber Caliphate. All of the subgroups that I've been showing over the past 5 slides have all now rolled up into UCC. UCC is what you could consider as the official ISIS arm of online activity, meaning they're the ones that are now performing rudimentary malware development, and I'll get to that, but also, again, paying attention and targeting operational technology environments, as well as banking industries, etc. And they're also responsible for now recruiting, distribution of arms, that kind of thing. And I'll talk about each of those pieces. But ultimately, the UCC is what you can consider truly ISIS operating online. Ultimately, as I've been researching UCC, I've divided the group into 3 primary functions. Media support on one side, digital attacks, and then fundraising. I've divided it out into these 3 specific areas because realistically, UCC has to function in each of these areas to be successful, to help provide funding and to help provide kind of the foundation for ISIS to be operating. These are the 3 different areas that they're really capitalizing on as it is right now. From this particular graph, what I'm trying to do is show each of the smaller subgroups that exist that are all helping and supporting ISIS operating across the globe realistically. And what I'm trying to show here is that each of these specific groups have a specific specialty. So for instance, the Anon Terror and Fighter Muslim group reports to United Cyber Caliphate in the center, and they're primarily responsible for the attack structure. You'll also notice that Kalichnikov.tn, for those of you that follow some of the Russian-based APT groups, that's possibly Russian APT. So I'm including that there because there's no confirmation of that piece. But these are the groups that are responsible within UCC for the targeting and trajectory. Again, that's more SQL injection, that kind of thing. Then we have additional media groups that are kind of listed out here. And again, I'll talk about each of these in greater detail. But it's talking about, in this case, a mock news agency, for instance, which is one of ISIS's primary transmission medias for transmitting all of their information, propaganda material, etc. And then finally, fundraising. And keep in mind that fundraising, when I'm referring to fundraising, I'm referring to not just fundraising for UCC as the group in its entirety, but I'm also referring to true fundraising in terms of for ISIS, meaning I'm watching arms deals attempting to happen on underground forums, etc. And I'm tying those groups in specifically to the fundraising side. Again, because they're funneling weapons for kinetic operations as well as hosting infrastructure for their own nefarious stuff. Now from a technology perspective. Realistically, I've broken down technology now by UCC into 8 subclassifiers. We have news and media kind of starting at the top, going all the way around from encryption, malware, fundraising, recruitment, communications and messaging, social media, attack tools, etc. And I'm going to talk about each of these subclasses and how ISIS and UCC leverages each of those particular areas. First is news and media. First, on this side, on the right side, is an actual Chrome plugin. I have not been able to locate the actual code for this. I actually took credit, as you can see, from Memory, which is a really great institution for studying terrorist activity. And that's actually a Chrome plugin that allows a mock news agency, which is ISIS or UCC's primary news distribution front, and this pipes their news directly into their browser. That way, anybody that's currently wanting to act or perform fundraising, etc., can have up-to-date news. On the left side is an application that is used, again, this is an actual Android app, and it's being used to, again, pipe in a mock news agency to be able to, obviously, look at news, look at kinetic operations that are happening, etc. A mock, from the news agency standpoint, they handle not only kinetic news information, meaning if there's a kinetic operation being handled somewhere in Syria, they handle that, as well as possible coordination of cyber attacks. So a mock performs many different functions. This is actually a PDF put out monthly by a French chapter of ISIS. And in this particular case, I took this screenshot from their guide because this is actually an operational security guide that ISIS had published. And this is all in French, but it's basically just saying use Tor, use HTTPS, all basic operational security stuff that all of us know. But this is really meant to target individuals that may not be as comfortable with using PGP, for instance, or Jabber, those kind of things. And this is published typically on a monthly basis, and it accounts for anything from operational security recommendations like this, all the way down to how to launder arms, how to make bombs, those kind of things. And this is just one example of how widely distributed this is, and it's pretty professional too, right? Meaning the graphics are pretty good. I'm not a graphic person, but I couldn't do that. So the graphics are pretty good, all told. This is a particular forum, an underground forum, that I'll get back into shortly. And this particular forum is obviously 100% centric on ISIS. And again, this is primarily utilized for coordinating kinetic attacks, coordinating digital attacks, and then also fundraising and funneling weapons and arms as well. And I'll get into some of the things behind underground forums and the way that ISIS utilizes that. And for those of you that want to go out and have your own fun with these forums and these sites, I'm going to give you some really great recommendations to cause them some problems, because that is a shitload of fun. Yeah. So this is another underground website, and as you can see, this particular site is distributing videos. And while this isn't necessarily true from like a digital attack standpoint, meaning this website isn't part of a command and control infrastructure for malware, but what they are distributing is obviously propaganda material. Again, these types of sites are, this was on an Onion URL that was, had an issue disclosing its real IP, and then, yeah, so we'll get into that. Again, there will be recommendations on how to cause these guys problems. From Facebook perspective, Facebook is being used very, very heavily by UCC to recruit as well as coordinate attacks. I've also witnessed over the past month and a half recently, that ISIS is now posting links to VirusTotal files directly in Facebook for other individuals to see. So they're either, in some cases, saying this file was embedded with malware, meaning this particular PDF that they're distributing was actually embedded with malware and is being redistributed, or they're also going out and attempting to create malware. Again, it's very, very script kiddie-ish, as you'll see momentarily. And that particular malware, again, they're showing on VirusTotal on Facebook to distribute the message to help individuals understand that not to open PDFs, that kind of thing. Luckily, Facebook is pretty good at taking these things down. Anytime that I come across social media pages that are obviously being operated by this group or any of the other ones that I've mentioned, like Gaza Hacker, etc., I immediately reach out to Facebook, Twitter, etc., and get them taken down if they're not already on that. And they're usually pretty good about it. How fast are they? It depends. Sometimes it shuts down even before I have a chance to take a screenshot. Whenever I request, it's usually within 12 hours. So it's pretty quick. I mean, all things considered, that's pretty quick from the way I look at it. But let's be honest, if I were looking at that page, it wouldn't take me very long to say, yeah, it's probably bad. Twitter, same kind of concept, right? And in this case, they do a lot of the same kind of thing, meaning they're distributing information, they're talking about, in this case, coordinating several attacks. And oftentimes, Twitter is the primary method that ISIS or UCC is using to coordinate attacks, meaning Twitter and Telegram, and I'll talk about Telegram momentarily as well. But as you can see, something else that's additionally interesting is the follower count on these are typically super low, meaning very, very rarely from an ISIS or UCC created account will it ever go above 100 followers. And that's for a multitude of different reasons, but usually in between 10 and 30 is about the cutoff point that I've been witnessing before Twitter starts to rip those down. Encryption. Luckily, ISIS is really, really bad, and UCC is really, really bad at development. They're just as bad at development as they are with developing malware. And luckily for us, they've developed 3 homemade encryption programs that are made for not just chat encryption. So, for instance, the bottom left is actually a Pigeon plugin. And then Mujahideen Secrets is in the middle. That's for messaging. So think of it as kind of a PGP, a cheap or easy, even though PGP is easy, but it's an easier version of PGP, making it more user-friendly. And then on the far right side is actually for true messaging. Luckily, for anyone that's interested in looking at these applications, they are extremely well, they're shit, to be honest. To be able to go out and actually look at the applications, anybody that's interested, let me know. There's several vulnerabilities present in each of these applications that actually pretty much renders their encryption methodologies completely useless. Again, feel free to reach out to me and I can share those files with you. Now on to recruitment. So this is a really nice little ad made for an actual dictionary app, specifically targeting Android users. And the disturbing thing about this isn't necessarily that it's a dictionary app. It's more along the lines that it's targeting children. So instead of, you know, I mean, it was really strange when I started to see this, primarily because I have a 4-year-old son and I sure as hell wouldn't show him how to, you know, say bullet or shotgun or tank, etc. So this was released 2 to 3 months ago, I think. And yeah, it was interesting in that regard. There was nothing embedded in this. That was primarily what I was thinking, is maybe there was an embedded backdoor or something like that. And no success. Ultimately, it's just a really cheesy recruitment dictionary method. Acquiring weapons. This has been something that has been happening quite regularly, as you might imagine. And it ultimately turns out that many of the sites and underground forums that I've been going on to and finding, specifically targeting UCC members, etc., now they're starting to heavily get involved in arms distribution and acquiring weapons. And they do that by funneling in money via Bitcoin, typically Bitcoin, and then they try to distribute that out. Luckily, they're not terribly successful because there's not a trust mechanism built in, meaning I could go out, create a fake web page and say, hey, donate to this, and I'll take all these Bitcoins and donate it. Obviously, I wouldn't do that, but either way you cut it, that's still something that's happening quite regularly. Also, something else to take note of, it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the email addresses listed, it's from an email address provider called Tutanota, which I'll talk about, but that's a very common Russian cybercriminal email app or email provider. And I'll talk about kind of that bleed over, but that's an interesting note. And for anybody that wants to go out and do some intelligence on this particular individual, the email addresses are really good to go after and have fun with. So feel free to go out and look at that stuff. Additionally, Facebook pages have actually popped up. And this is obviously for reach, meaning they can go out and reach a larger audience. But also, if you've noticed, they actually put down that this particular page was a movie character page. They did that primarily to try to swoop under Facebook's collective umbrella of analyzing and taking that data down. So in this case, Facebook was not successful at doing that. Primarily, again, because movie character is the defined page, whereas this is actually an arms market that was being distributed out. So, again, there's not many members in this specific group, but it has grown over the past month and a half. I've already talked about this particular app, and again, it's important to note that these have massive vulnerabilities, and I will share those files with you if you'd like. From a communication and messaging standpoint, internal communication within UCC happens nearly exclusively on Telegram. that's great from an operational security or from an intelligence perspective, because I can typically just hop into these channels with fake accounts and then start to monitor what's happening on those channels without having to necessarily participate. Some of the groups on Telegram are a little bit more closed, meaning they expect participation, and others don't. So for instance, this particular Telegram channel, which is no longer active, and it's been migrated off, but ultimately this particular group was being used for a very long time for coordinating attacks and coordinating digital attacks as well. And in this particular channel, I just hopped on and literally just basically sat back and watched everything go on and just logged everything and just went from there. This is another additional page that I found, and this particular page happened on justpaste.it, which is similar to Pastebin, but UCC almost always exclusively uses just pasted. Why? I don't know necessarily, but they are. Additionally, you can see that these provide a gigantic wealth of information because oftentimes they'll include domains for underground forums that I either wasn't familiar with or I haven't pivoted and found. So if I go in and find some of these posts, I'll immediately start crawling and pulling out any web page that I can, and then immediately go out and do intelligence on those specific domains. It's also kind of interesting to notice and to note that oftentimes the UCC will post specific Kinetic operation information on Just Pasted as well, so you can actually pull out Kinetic operations. And right now I have a Just Pasted crawler that's actually crawling every post from their API, purposely trying to parse out this information and look for additional posts, etc.
Are they in English or is it mostly?
It varies. It varies. So most of the time the posts are in Arabic, but the links are in traditional English. Which is great for us because, again, from an intelligence perspective, I can easily go out and figure that out. And luckily, the Arabic, oftentimes they're just linking a bunch of pages. So it's great from a crawling perspective to be able to pull that stuff. This particular site's called Al Bayan Radio, and this is an interesting page that will consistently change primarily because hosting providers take it down. Hosting providers take this particular radio station down because it is a primary method for radio broadcast for UCC and ISIS. It's typically operating in the Middle Eastern area, and you can tie into Al Bayan Radio from all over the world, obviously, but it's being broadcast, traditionally speaking, from Syria or Iraq, is almost always where it originates from. And this is interesting because, again, hosting providers consistently take it down, but you can get a tremendous wealth of information, primarily from a Kinetic operation standpoint, by listening to Al Bayan Radio. They're not really planning as much from a cyber standpoint here, but keeping in mind that it is discussed and there are operational security items that are discussed on that radio station. And again, I'm blocking out URLs, etc., but feel free again to reach out to me and I can give you all of those. At least this has changed and a few other things have, but from a communications and messaging standpoint, there's one kind of interesting parallel that I've seen here. And one is, if you notice, most of these providers between like Ghostmail, for instance, and Tutanota, etc., are mostly tool sets utilized by cyber criminals. And I think that's primarily my opinion is that that's happening because they've realized that their home-brewed developed tools are shit. Meaning they know that they can't develop tools worth a damn, so we're going to use stuff that works. We know it works, and it's minimally cheap, and it's extremely easy to use. You can use a web portal, you can use Tor to access it, etc., and then you move on with your day, and it adds a layer of security, realistically. But it's important to understand that that is starting to bleed over, and I'll show that in just a second. But as I started to notice, a lot of the recommendations that UCC was making to ISIS members operating in the field was using Proton Mail, Tutanota, SIGINT, all the different providers that you would traditionally see, again, on underground forums that are traditionally Russian, that kind of thing. So that's an interesting thing that I've been watching, and that's important to pay attention to, ultimately. I'm sorry? So it was that way starting in June of 2016 is when I started to witness it. Before then, I was noticing a lot of homemade tools, a lot of the stuff that I've discussed. June, July of 2016 is when I started to see a pretty major shift in that. From an attack tool standpoint, they've also luckily developed some homemade attack tools. as you might expect, these tools are garbage. There are really three kind of DDoS tools that they've created. One is the Caliphate Cannon, which is complete garbage. Infos Encryptor and Homemade DDoS Tool. I call it Homemade DDoS Tool because it has no name, so I've named it Homemade DDoS Tool. It's really clever, I know. It took a long time to come up with that name. And it's actually listed here. That's the actual application. And again, it is extraordinarily easy to mitigate any attacks coming from this. And realistically, the amount of attack surface that they were leveraging to distribute and to perform the denial of service, at one point, the largest attack that I saw was being distributed from 20 machines. So it's not a huge amount of activity behind this. That's why you don't really hear about successful DDoS attacks from UCC. Although CNN tells you otherwise. From a file sharing perspective, there's one primary point or one primary site that I've been witnessing UCC use over the past year, and it's gulf-up.com. And this particular site is regional, meaning it's based in the Middle East, and that is possibly one of the primary reasons that they're using it to distribute that, as well as from a regional availability standpoint. But this is one of the most recommended places and one of the places that you'll most likely see posts of file examples, propaganda material, videos, images, etc. More than likely going to flow up to Gulf up at some point. Now on to malware. As I mentioned, UCC dabbles in malware. It's really, really bad. And I was on a site called I won't pronounce it properly, so I'm not gonna even try. But this particular site is similar to Just Paste It, and again, this is primarily utilized to distribute information. Well, I'd gone out to this particular website, and I had found an interesting article, and I blocked out some of the stuff because there is information there that I used for pivoting and for gathering more intelligence. And ultimately, I found an open directory on that particular site. And once I found the open directory, I figured, okay, has anybody here ever played NBA Jam, like on Super Nintendo or Nintendo? That's what I call Moneyball. You know, Moneyball, 3-point, you know, yeah. That's what I call Moneyball. Because right now I see a directory that's called Files. That, for me, is like, okay, this is good stuff. So I decided to go into the Files directory. I won't show that for legality purposes. And on this particular site, in the file directory, I found one specific file. And I have the hash here. Feel free to write it down, or again, I can send it to you. Ultimately, it appears that this was built with what's called the Ancalog exploit builder, which, for those of you that are familiar with Ancalog, it is a traditional cybercriminal tool. It is, again, script kiddie friendly, and it is not complex. As you can see in the code snippet, and I'll show in the next slide, the code snippet has something that is even better, meaning it has a domain now. I work at domain tools, so that is something that I feel really confident in, is basically destroying domain names. And in this case, it did provide some good value. And on that particular site, isdirat.in, that site also had open directories. There was one thing you had to do to get past the open directories. Feel free to go out and look yourself, and you'll see what I mean. It's still open as of last night. And what's interesting is, whenever you pull down the files listed on that drop server, because ultimately I've correlated that to be a true drop server, there's photos, and a lot of photos, meaning photos of some guy boarding an airplane. And there's also photos of actual kinetic operations, meaning there's people firing mortars there, and it's all unbranded, meaning that it hasn't gone to UCC's propaganda arm yet, meaning these are kinetic individuals that are video recording mortar operations against the Iraqi army, and then they're posting it here. Other UCC individuals get onto this drop server, pull the files down, make edits, post it back, and then it distributes out from there. What's really great about this is they never scrub metadata. So, yeah, so from a metadata perspective, whenever I scrape all those image files, I literally run it through. In this case, I popped it onto here because it's a really nice little graphical user interface. But you can basically mass export metadata from each of the pictures, and literally get up to the second where people are operating, because they're not really that great at operational security. So from a kinetic operation standpoint, you can see this is pretty interesting, right? And you'll also oftentimes probably remember in the past 2 years, there's been 4 people directly tied to UCC, ISIS's digital group, that have been killed by drone strikes. So you can kind of start to connect those dots, right? Just saying. Now on to attacks. And I kind of mentioned here just a high-level history. I'm not going to go through each of these because it would all bore you to tears. But what's important here is the drone strikes that I was mentioning. If you notice, back in 2015, a guy named Jannad Hussein is kind of running the cyber caliphate at that time. You'll notice that he gets killed pretty quickly thereafter in a drone strike. Islamic Cyber Army then comes into creation pretty quickly thereafter. Another individual takes over, and then he's killed in a drone strike. Sally Jones maintains a violent social media. You can start to see there's a theme here, a pattern of drone strikes. Yeah, it almost seems like there's some logic built in here. I don't get it. And then in March of 2017, what's interesting is Amok News, the news agency I've been referring to this whole talk, was actually compromised and started to distribute NJRAT, which is really awesome. Somebody was either trolling them really hard, or it was somebody, well, it was probably somebody trolling. But that was also fun. So yeah, what you can see here is just ebb and flow of someone takes over and then a drone strike. Someone takes over, drone strike, etc. So if any of you are entrepreneurial and are considering going out to do some of this, I would recommend looking against that. Yeah. Because there's a high likelihood you're going to be part of that pattern. From an attack overview, so most of the time these individuals are performing DDoS attacks. And I say that loosely. And what I mean is they are not big, and they are not very structured, and it is not earth-shattering. Also, defacements. They're very, very proud of making defacements, and they're very proud of making defacements on websites that no one has ever heard of. Like, literally no one has ever heard of. It's like thegiantweasel.xxx. Like, literally, that's the kind of stuff that they'll deface, and then they'll post and act like it was this giant deal. It's all shit. And then compromising databases via simple SQL injection. That, again, is very, very basic, nothing advanced. Kill lists, and then Twitter and Facebook account compromises, which have kind of become an MO of theirs as well. A few interesting case studies. One particular time, some hackers from, at this case, they were part of an offshoot group, and they had hacked Hobart International Airport in Australia, defaced their webpage for a little over an hour, and that was it. So they claimed success, and they moved on. U.S. Air Force personnel leak. In this case, they had leaked out a database that they had gained access to that was primarily storing drone pilot information. So if any of you are drone pilots, or have been drone pilots, or associated with drone piloting, and I don't mean like, drones like consumer drones, it would probably behoove you to look at this, although there has not been any direct correlation between someone actually getting killed off of one of these lists. So keep that in mind. Some additional U.S. government personnel. This ranged from United States government entities as well as military entities. So it's across the board. And again, what they were listing out is passwords, emails, etc. All for, in this case, they were looking for a kill list, but also just to make their lives hell. Based on this information, also, there hasn't really been any reported actual incidents tied to this data, meaning that they published this and nothing was really ever done with it.
Is this, in your experience, is this like first party, or are they just like taking Ashley Madison dump, scrapping out?
Yeah. So a combination of both. It's both. In some cases, like the Air Force database, they actually compromised an external facing database. In that case, they only got, I think, 23 records. So, I mean, it wasn't anything. And it's a combination of both. So. And then multiple kill lists. And what you'll notice is throughout a multiple period of time, they publish multiple kill lists. But look at the numbers, right? 56 New Jersey State police officers. We're not really talking a massive amount here, or we're not talking about what CNN has you believe, that they're in everyone's machines in this room as we speak right now, operating, looking for bad things and trying to destroy your life. 36 Minnesota police officers, etc. So the statistics don't prove that there's that much happening, right? Granted, the 8,000 civilians from around the world, that was published and it was accurate. That data was accurate. But we don't know, to Ronnie's point, we don't know if that's because they were pulling that information from haveibeenpwned.com or if they were just literally truly compromising databases that contain PII and siphoning that out. So again, what I'm trying to show is that the bark is a lot louder than the bite in this case. From a trending perspective, most of the forums that are underground locations for these individuals are operating on vBulletin. For those of you that are familiar with vBulletin, you'll also realize that it is extraordinarily vulnerable, almost every version for the most part. And they're not really that great at updating. So now you can start to connect those dots. I'm not going to go any further with that from a legality perspective, but pay attention to vBulletin. Also, obviously, there were some internally developed tools up until about a year and a half ago, and they slowly, again, started to migrate towards cybercriminal tool sets. And they're doing that again because I think they realized that not only are their applications vulnerable because they have published known vulnerabilities in some of the applications, but they've also realized that it's a lot easier to use tool sets that actually work. They've dabbled with malware, and as I mentioned here, it's albeit terribly, meaning not very good. And there's a lack of expertise in much of anything. And I say besides OPSEC because realistically, the only operational security that they perform is just using domain privacy protection. That's really it. Which is easy to circumvent in a lot of cases and get around and actually find true details there. So their OPSEC is also really, really bad. And then finally, kind of to some of my main points. Psychological, political, and economic forces ultimately have kind of combined, right, to promote this fear of cyber terrorism. Ultimately, if UCC or other attack groups that fit into that realm attract more technically savvy users or more technically savvy individuals that want to cause problems, a true incident could occur, but it hasn't as of yet. And then ultimately, one of my primary things is, are cyber terrorists, and I'm using that in quotes, technologically capable? As it stands right now, I'm not viewing them as hugely technologically capable. Again, because that's based on operational security of their domains, the tool sets they're using, how they're registering those domains, how they're leveraging malware, how they're doing all of these different things. Again, I'm not saying that they're not going to go that route, but as it is right now, I'm not seeing the FUD behind it. Ultimately, should we be concerned? Of course. I mean, just like anything within security, we should be monitoring this closely. We should be monitoring the tactics closely, and we should be trying to understand possible motivations and changing TTPs, right? But should we be concerned? Within reason. Again, the proof doesn't show that these individuals are truly technologically advanced. Realistically, from an intelligence community standpoint, most of the concern appears to be kind of around the dissemination of material, meaning trying to do fundraising, trying to do recruitment efforts, etc. That's where a majority of the concern relies because, again, their technological capabilities are not that great. As I mentioned before, many terrorist groups borrow tools and techniques from cybercriminals. Most of those techniques are old, which again, from an intelligence perspective, is great. And then ultimately, I just had to mention terrorist losers at least once because of our president. Terrorist losers. So I think there's a couple of minutes for questions if anybody has them. Yeah, sure.
In your research, have you discovered other organizations such as, let's say, the countries using this as a front to attack us?
Yeah, so that's a good question because at the beginning of the talk, whenever I mentioned the Cyber Kalishnikov group, there have been several reports and a lot of attribution tied back to that group actually being Russian in origin. I'm not going to make an attribution claim, but there has been lots of discussion. Yeah, I don't make attribution claims. But there have been a lot of discussions that was possibly a Russian state group operating.
So there was the Cyber Caliphate back in popped TV5 Mon.
Yeah, TV5 Mon.
That at first I think a lot of people thought was
yeah.
One of these groups, but the malware was in operation was way more sophisticated
Yeah.
than any of this. I think it was malware tied to one of the suspected mentioned.
Yeah, it was tied supposedly to APT 28. So again, I'm not going to get into that piece. I just know that there has been a lot of attribution discussions about some of those groups, specifically about the TV Mond attack, as well as a few additional ones. So I think that is happening to some degree, for sure, personally. Yep.
You mentioned one of these groups was investigating power grid.
Yeah.
Are they actually getting to the point where they might be able to do some damage then, or is it mainly?
So right now, all I've seen is distribution of informational material. So for instance, in one case, I saw a PDF being traded that basically listed out ICS protocols, so like DNP3, et cetera, and the port number, and that was it. And then they listed a little bit of high-level information, like no authentication, no encryption, et cetera, but it wasn't, they weren't, by no means were they in any systems, nor were they attempting to access anything that I saw. It was, again, just trading of information, et cetera. So again, at this point, I don't view that as a huge concern. Not to say that they're not looking at that closer, but from my perspective, I haven't witnessed that yet. Cool. Yep.
How are you like protecting yourself while you're doing this research, both from the standpoint and obviously our government?
Yeah. So a lot of the work that I'm doing with this, I started the work whenever I was at Trend Micro, and then whenever I went to government contractor, I continued to work there, and then I've been continuing to work over the past 2 years. Part of that is creating realistic personas on some of these forums, but that's working. I'm working with law enforcement and intelligence at that point to obviously protect myself from obvious issues there. And then additionally, using a separate internet line with my own private VPN and then going out that line just for accessing this material. I don't have any confirmation that they're checking like access logs or anything on their web servers. Not to say they're not doing it. I'm just paranoid in that regard. But that's realistically a majority of what I'm doing. I'm leveraging Tor, my own personal VPN, going out my own INET line, a separate INET line completely independent of me, not owned by me, etc. And then if I'm accessing servers overseas, meaning looking at open stuff, I'll typically use a couple different methods for that, and we can talk about it afterwards if you want. So. All right, good. Sorry about the technical difficulties, everybody.